Hi, I'm Andre. Welcome back to Metapunk Zero. In this episode of the Psychosis Diaries, I'm going to be talking about my psychosis experience itself. I'm going to be getting into some details of what that was like and what I sort of witnessed and what my thinking was like. And I should warn you now, this could get a little dark. The themes that I encountered in my psychosis experience were very dark. Not all psychosis experiences are dark the way mine was, my most recent one, but they quite often can be, and so that's just a warning to anybody who might be sensitive to that, particularly with dark religious themes or magical themes and that kind of thing. Just be careful, be aware of this going into the video. So without further ado, though, let's get into it. Hi, so welcome back. Um, it's kind of hard to know where to begin with this, and I'm going to try to make this as comprehensive as I can without making it like super long. I mean, I experienced psychosis for 8 months in 2023, so it would be pretty ridiculous to expect that I might include the entire experience in this video, and so I'm trying not to put too much pressure on myself to do that, but I do want to convey a clear sense of what it was like so that people can understand. And that's kind of my purpose in sharing this, is to really convey what a psychosis experience is like, at least a dark one. Not all of them, as I said, are like this, but mine certainly was, particularly my most recent one in 2023. And I want people to understand it so that if they start to experience symptoms of it, then they can be aware of what's going on, and then hopefully have some presence of mind to be able to take measures to remedy that. But whatever that looks like for them, I'm not. This is not medical advice or anything like that. I'm not a doctor, but and I don't know. I'm a little critical of the mainstream mental health system as well, and so maybe that's not always the approach you want to take, but quite often we do get over our heads with this stuff. So it's good to know kind of how these things can start and what they can feel like. And I also want people to understand what it's like to go through it, if they're not going through it, or if they've never been through it, what it's like for somebody who is in their lives who is going through it. Whether that's you passing somebody on a street who's clearly in another space, another headspace, and whatever's going on in their lives, if it would just promote some understanding to help, like it would be helpful to understand what that person's going through. And then if you have a loved one that's going through this, then understanding what they're going through. And then also for doctors, anybody who might be a medical professional watching, what it's like, because I think a big problem that I have with the mental health system is that doctors really don't understand psychosis. They really don't know what it's like, and they don't know that a lot of what they do is actually very harmful to people in psychosis. And so for those reasons and more, I'm sharing this. I also just kind of want to express myself, and so with that preamble out of the way, I'll start talking about how it started. I had been like the last 5-6 years of my life have been very difficult. I came out of a relationship. Um, I mean, let's go back a little further than that. In 2004 to 2006, I experienced my first psychosis, or my first series of psychoses, and I was hospitalized for that, and then I lived on disability. I lived with family for a while. I didn't have a lot of money. I lived in poverty. I struggled to find work. I struggled to rebuild my life, and even to rebuild a good, stable sense of my reality and my sense of being in the world and my sense of identity. And but I did, and so after about 14 years of trying to figure that out and sorting that out, I was pretty healthy, and I had a good idea of where I wanted to go with life. I wanted to write, and I wanted to practice philosophy and animistic practice in order to try to understand my psychosis experience and to be of service to other people who might be going through that, or who just are going through difficult emotional times, you know, and that really mattered to me. And I got into a relationship, which was something that I really hadn't ever done before. That's part of my journey. Part of the reason why I think I went into psychosis in the first place was because I'd really struggled all my life with relationships, and particularly intimate relationships. And so finding a girlfriend and, you know, and being able to, you know, express myself emotionally that way, and everything else, you know, that comes with a relationship, and that really was a challenge for a long time. But in what was it? Sometime around 2017, I met somebody, sort of through other people that I knew, and we got together, and it was I mean, it was good. It was intense. We had similar interests. We had a lot in common. We had similar career paths, at least on the one hand, in terms of writing and sort of creative interests. And yeah, anyway, to make a long story short, it was a conflict-filled relationship. We both had our respective trauma, and it was very difficult. And so that ended in early 2020. And you know, without going into detail, it was not a pleasant. I mean, there was a lot of good stuff, but it was a very difficult relationship for me, and for her as well, I'm sure. And the way I had to leave that relationship was not. I wasn't happy with that. I really didn't feel good about it, but I didn't really feel like I had a choice. But I had a lot of guilt about that, and I had a lot of hurt. I had a lot of grief. I had a lot of anger about what went on, and so I was sort of sitting in those emotions in early 2020, and then COVID happened. And so I had moved out. I was living with friends for a short period of time, and I was expecting to get back to work and then continue my life. You know, at least I had a job that I thought I'd gotten a job finally that I thought was going to lead to some career freedom, and be a way that I could balance my life and finance my writing habit and my interests in creative pursuits, and just sort of get me in a stable position where I could really start to build a life. You know, that's what I had hoped for. And so I had a lot of hopes riding on my job, and even though the relationship had fallen apart and I was really grieving, at least I was living with friends, and I was like, okay, well, I'll take a breath, and then I'll get back on my feet and get started. And then COVID happened, and so the quarantine started, and that work was shut down for several months. I was lucky because I worked in an industry where there was sufficient cause and reason, and sufficiently high stakes that people were willing to invest in a lot of safety measures to make sure that the industry could go back to work. And so we did. And so within what was it, March is when COVID, like when the quarantines were announced. I hate calling them lockdowns. I really dislike the fact that the media jumped on the idea of a lockdown, because a quarantine makes sense. A quarantine is something you do when people are sick. A lockdown is a prison term. And so everybody did feel like they were in prison, but I think calling it that, using that kind of language, really changed the narrative and shifted everybody's emotions about it. And I think that contributed to a lot of the negativity that we saw around COVID and around vaccines and around medical treatment and all of that stuff. And whatever you want to believe about that, I still believe the term lockdown was a form of propaganda. But anyway, the quarantines happened in about March, and by August or September, I was able to get back to work, and then I finally had earned enough money that I was able to afford my own apartment. So I moved out on my own, and I spent the next 2 to 3 years living on my own and working. I never was able to get financially stable because the industry that I was in, we still had COVID to contend with, at least in the beginning there. But it's prone to strikes. It's prone to fluctuations in the way the market works in that industry. And I worked in film, so that nobody's really wondering. I've mentioned that in other videos. I worked in the film industry, and so film is prone to fluctuations like this sometimes, even though it's sort of resistant to a lot of other things that can beset other industries. It's sort of prone to strikes and that kind of thing. And so there were some strikes. There was a threat of a strike in about, I think, 2021, and then there were 2 actual strikes in late 2022 into 2023. And so by late 2022, it's also seasonal where I live. Because they don't film in the winter not much is filmed in the winter. Some things are, but not nearly as much as is filmed in the summer. And so work really dries up if you don't have a lot of seniority. And so work was drying up already, and then there were 2 strikes by I believe the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild. And so these things were largely about AI and all these things that are coming down the pipe of the world, and technology and all this sort of stuff that could, this is one of the reasons we need basic income and, all these other factors, because the industry, the working world is going to change quite profoundly in the next few years, and this was something that they wanted to head off in the film industry. And so there were some strikes, and so even as the season was slowing down, I knew that I wasn't going to get much more work. And so I was really frustrated because I'd struggled to find a balance. Film is a demanding industry. It demands a lot of hard work for a lot of hours. You have no life while you're working, but when you're not working, you have no income coming in. And so it was really difficult to find the balance that I'd hoped I'd find, especially with these strikes happening. So in late 2022, I was looking for work. I was trying to find another job, and as you might know, if you've been looking lately, just the way the world is going, and part of it being AI, part of it being automated applicant tracking software, and all the other reasons why it's difficult, and economically and so forth, it's hard to find a job. And especially for somebody like me, who has I have kind of a mixed resume. I have a lot of different experiences from a lot of different places, but I've been coping with mental health challenges most of my life, and that's really affected my career. I also, my main career being my own writing and everything else, that's why I'd hoped that my film career would allow me to finance that, and it just turned out not to be the case because of all these other factors, COVID and the strikes and so on. So I was looking for work and not having much luck, and so I got really down on myself. I was still going through all the grieving. I was still very isolated. And so all these factors, emotional turmoil, trauma from the relationship that had ended, trauma, grief, guilt, anger, hurt, all of that, isolation due to COVID, my only real social contacts, I did have some friends that I could contact every now and then, but they had lives and everything else. So my only actual social contact on a regular basis was my coworkers at work. And so when I wasn't working, I didn't really have any social contact. And so I felt very isolated. And when you're going through when you're going through a grieving process, and when you're dealing with a lot of difficult emotions and you're on your own, it can be very difficult. And so, and isolation itself, as we've covered in previous videos, isolation itself for long periods of time can lead to symptoms of psychosis and other things. And so I was very much very lonely, and feeling all of this. And so around about December of 2022, I was broke. I was desperate. I was really worried about how I was going to be paying my rent and buying groceries and that kind of thing. So I was financially very insecure. I was really isolated, and I had all these other difficult emotions from the relationship, and I was angry, and I suddenly found myself unable to sleep. And that really persisted. I would sleep maybe a few hours a night, if that. Sometimes I would go long stretches, like several days at a time, without any sleep. And I was getting really angry. And I was talking online. My only social contact was online, or my only regular social contact at this point was online. And I was on a social media platform, and I was having a conversation with somebody about Metapunk. And I really had pinned a lot of hopes. Okay, so the relationship had fallen apart, the job had fallen apart, my working life had fallen apart. I was very alone and isolated, but at least I still had this idea of what I wanted to do creatively, and the kind of the mission of Metapunk, and the, you know, getting the philosophy out there and getting people to understand it, and to try to share those ideas and everything else. And I was experimenting with making these YouTube videos and that kind of thing, but I wasn't having a lot of luck. I wasn't pleased with the results. And anyway, I'm having this conversation on social media with somebody, and he seemed like he was really, really interested in what I had to say, but he started questioning me, and he was asking me questions about it. I was trying to explain to him kind of how it works, and it really didn't kind of go well. It seemed like he didn't understand. He didn't really want to understand, and even though he was sort of superficially interested, he really wasn't interested in the meat of it. And I just kind of got frustrated because nothing in my life was working. And so I really came away from that conversation wondering, like, what is the point of anything? I can't get anything across to people. Nothing's working in my life. Like, what am I doing? And I wasn't sleeping, and I was really, really angry at the world, and at my life, at my ex, at myself, you know, very much at myself. And so, you know, I didn't know what to do. Well, the day after, I had this feeling of like what's the point, you know, of anything? Just feeling like I wanted to give up on life. I got a phone call from one of the jobs I had applied to, which, you know, it wasn't a glamorous job. It was a minimum wage job, doing manual labor in a busy environment. And I wasn't real pleased with that. I wasn't super excited to do this job, but at least it was something. At least it would be some money coming in. I took the job, and that started in late December of 2022 and went into January of 2023. And so I worked there for about a month, and I still wasn't sleeping. I was still very angry. The working hours of this job were not really conducive to good sleep or good health for me. It was shift work, you know, like kind of like factory work. So I worked the afternoon shift, which started about, you know, mid-afternoon and ended around 11 o'clock. I'd get home about midnight and try to eat dinner and go to bed. And so I really wasn't doing well. I was also still very isolated and very, very much frustrated with my life. And so all this anger kind of was boiling up in me, and I was getting really frustrated on the road, and I wasn't sleeping. And so, you know, of course, I wasn't able to really like get rid of the stress or deal with the stress, you know. And so one night at work, after I had just kind of gone through, there was some security screenings and measures that had to go into this particular job because of the work environment. And I had just sort of gone through the final round of that security screening, and I just kind of lost it that day. I went back to work that night and or that afternoon and evening, and I was hearing things, you know. I couldn't make sense of my life, and it seemed like my thoughts had taken on a life of their own, you know, in a way. And so there was all these conflicting thoughts. And really what you can think about it as, the way I think about it, was that my mind was trying to solve the problem of my life. You know, I had all these problems that had stacked up, and for whatever reason, I hadn't been able to deal with them, despite trying very hard and working very hard for several years to try to lift myself out of the situation that my first psychosis had put me in, you know. And you know, and I mean, there's more to it than that, but I mean, you know, there was abuse and stuff over the years and all that stuff, but I'd been really trying to turn my life around, and I'd worked very hard, and I hadn't had any luck, and so I was trying to solve the problem of this, and it's like, so my mind was racing, you know, trying to fix the problem, trying to find any possible solution, and kind of going in circles very much, and I'd been depressed for a while, you know, and very upset and very angry. And so that's also those loops of rumination, and so your thoughts really circle around, you know, like my mind was racing, you know. That's the best way to sum it up, and trying to solve this problem. And so it's like the problem itself, like the thoughts were starting to bounce around, like there was just this extra feedback that my mind was generating, you know, like that's how I can kind of look at it. But it started to feel very metaphysical, and as you probably have surmised from my channel, I'm very metaphysically open. Part of Metapunk is metaphysics. You know, that's where the meta comes from, or at least that's one part of where the meta in Metapunk comes from. is metaphysics, and being animistic and spiritually inclined, I was open to the idea of spirit guides and these, what do you want to call them, forces from the unseen, right? And lots of people engage with those things quite meaningfully, and they manage to be perfectly functional. You know, part of the problem is Western science views these things as delusional, you know, just on the face of it, whether or not a person is functional at all. I remember hearing a story from this was actually from a therapist at one point, but she worked in a hospital, and she told me a story. She was also spiritually inclined, but she also had a problem with this story as she was telling it to me. She was mentioning that she had another client who had come in presenting with depression, and she had spoken to a psychiatrist in the emergency department and talked about her depression. But when they asked her about her life, she said she was Wiccan, you know, that she was neo-pagan. And because she had said that, the doctors thought she was delusional. They thought she might have psychosis because she professed to be Wiccan, you know. And so imagine that, you know, it's less common. It happens less often probably with more mainstream religious systems, you know, like if somebody goes into a hospital and says they're Christian, they're probably not likely to get quite as harshly labeled, or maybe not quite as immediately labeled, but that's a problem already when the medical community already looks at spiritual beliefs as if they're delusional, you know, just on the face of it. But I'm open to this stuff, and so when I was going through it, I did at first feel like it was a spiritual sort of experience, you know, and I still feel that way. There was all these religious themes, and I'll get into that. You know, I've been talking for a while already. I'll probably edit some of this video down, but I want people to understand what goes into this experience. So I started hearing voices. I started being more focused on my thoughts than I was on my immediate physical environment. And it was as I was trying to solve the problems that I was going through in life, and everything started to take on a meaning. Because when you're trying to solve a problem, you're looking for any avenue of attack. You know, you're looking for any way that you can figure out a solution to what you're going through. And so you're searching everywhere, and everything starts to take on meaning. And this is like a really profound sense of synchronicity. Carl Jung talked about, the psychiatrist Carl Jung is a very different kind of psychiatrist than most other psychiatrists. And he talked about this experience you can have where external events line up with your internal world, you know, and so you could be thinking something, you know, and most of us have had an experience of synchronicity, you know. It's not really that far out, you know, or far-fetched, you know, but imagine you're thinking to yourself one day, you're wandering around, and it's like, oh yeah, I haven't spoken to Carol in a while. I wonder what Carol's up to. And then she calls 10 minutes later, you know. And that kind of thing happens all the time, and people joke about that, you know, serendipity and providence, and there's words for it, right? Where you're thinking one thing, and then some event in your external reality occurs, and that's a synchronicity. It's a synchronicity when it happens once or twice during your day, or like maybe every now and then, but not terribly major. But when you start to when you're looking for meaning anywhere you can find it, because your life itself has proven not to be constructively meaningful, because you've just encountered all these problems, it's like your whole psyche's trying to reorient itself and trying to rebuild itself, because the way that it was arranged before can't figure out the problems. So it's like your mind is trying to take itself apart and reassemble itself, and at the same time it's interpreting the world, trying to figure out what's actually meaningful. It's almost like a factory reboot, you know. You can think of it like that, you know. When you reset, you go back to first principles. And so when you're a child, when you're an infant in the world, you're reading meaning into everything, and you're trying to learn how your environment works. Well, this is what's going on, but in an adult brain, with all the adult problems you've got, and all the history and all the memories and everything that's sort of weighing on your mind in terms of problems, you're searching for meaning everywhere, and so everything takes on meaning. And so I I was at work, I was still doing my job, but I was having these sort of like thoughts pull me out of kind of where I was at the time. And then somebody started a conversation with me, and it was started out being a friendly conversation, but it quickly turned into this woman revealing just how grossly intolerant she was. You know, she had a lot of bigotry and stuff, and I had a problem with that. I didn't know how to address that because I was already very stressed and very much in this other place, and so I didn't know what to say to her. But it's really weird because just at the moment that she kind of revealed how intolerant she was, and I was trying to figure out like, okay, like I should just turn around and walk away from this person. These other people came in and were talking about other events, and they had personal meaning for me because they were relevant to my failed relationship and they were relevant to what I was going through, and it felt really surreal. It felt like my whole world had come alive, and these people, it's like they knew what I was thinking, or they were reacting to my thoughts, and they were talking about things that had been on my mind. And so it was like I was in a stage play. The whole thing, it was like it was set up and staged, and these people were doing a performance to mess with my mind, and that's how it felt. And that's kind of how it started, So I know that's a long preamble. I've talked for 20 minutes already about this, but that's how it started. It's all this solving problem and problem solving and meaning, finding meaning everywhere in synchronicities. And so I went home that night. I was really panicked. I was freaking out after this, and thankfully I was right at the end of my shift. And I got in my car. I went home. I experienced incredible road rage on the road going home. I was just like angry and snarling at traffic and snarling at the radio, and I was just overwhelmed with anger. It was very interesting because nothing in my life was working, and it felt like my life was being torn apart, and it felt like external things to me, like these people that were sort of actors, in that little stage play, drama, were pulling my life apart, and it didn't feel good at all. I felt, and so obviously I was very paranoid about this, but I was really like very confused and very angry. And I went home and I went to bed. I had a really bizarre dream of people offering me a choice that was very bizarre and almost cartoonish. I had some really weird dreams as I sort of like, I wasn't even really asleep. I was in a sort of a half waking state. I didn't sleep well, and then I must have eventually dozed off, because I did wake up the next morning, and I woke up and my world was different, and I don't know how to explain that in clear terms. I just knew that I was in a different world than I had been when I'd gone to bed. And from a medical standpoint, that would be classified as a delusion. There was not much that was physically different about my world, but the felt sense of my world, the visceral sense of where I was totally different. And I think this is really interesting because this shines a light on the way that the medical system treats these things, because the medical system would look at your beliefs and then just try to categorize them as true or false. And they would say that, well, that belief is obviously false, or it's demonstrably false, or it's certainly not provable, it's unfalsifiable from a scientific standpoint, which means it doesn't have any meaning in a materialistic worldview, and that means that it's a delusion. But I think metaphorically, it makes a lot of sense. I had just gone through this sense of drama. I felt like my world was tearing itself apart or being torn apart. I felt very much at the mercy of forces beyond my control, the failed relationship, the failed job search, the failed job in the first place, and then the failed job search after, that only led to this minimum wage job and all of that. I felt very much at the mercy of all these forces that were much bigger than me, and very, very much didn't care about my well-being or what I was doing, and so I really felt like I was living in a different world than I had gone to bed in. My world was coming apart, and so it makes sense that I would feel like I was in a different world, or a wrong world. So I woke up. I had that. I had conversations with some family, and I remember I still wasn't sleeping very well. I would try to go to sleep. I would lie awake for hours. Eventually, I might doze off or whatever. But you know, because I did wake up in a few times and feel very strange when I woke up. But it was just getting progressively worse. And this is what it felt like was just everything starting to fall apart. And I also had things talking at me or to me, you know, and that also makes sense, you know, that obviously on the face of it, that's a hallucination, you know, medically that's a hallucination. But when you take somebody who's been isolated for 2.5, 3 years, isolated, financially insecure, grieving and depressed, angry, upset, just not doing well in life, and the only person they have to talk to is themselves, then the walls start talking to you, you know, like literally your environment starts speaking to you, you know. And so that all makes sense. The loneliness had become too much and it was overwhelming me. I was flooded with these overwhelming emotions, and so it was like my brain had gone into a dream state and all of these things were coming to life, and it was very much like a fairy tale or like a Disney cartoon, you know. There's a lot of things that happen in Psychosis that very much feel like that, you know, like, or if, I don't know if anybody remembers Roger Rabbit, you know, that movie that came out, and when they go, and it's a world where cartoons are alive and they live in contact with human beings, you know, and so you have flesh and blood human beings talking and interacting with cartoons, and then there's also Toontown. And when at one point the protagonist drives into Toontown, and literally everything talks to you in Toontown, you know. Everything is alive and has a personality and has an animating spirit, you know. That's very much an animistic state of mind, you know. It's an altered state of consciousness, but it's very dreamlike. And you think about it, children are also in a state like this a lot of the time. Children give personalities to a lot of things in their environment, particularly what they call transitional objects like teddy bears and things, where they're like sort of attachment bonds that are formed to, you know, for comfort, you know, for emotional comfort. You have your emotional support teddy bear, you know, and you have all of these things, and we do that. And even grown adults will sometimes attribute personalities to things, you know. They'll give their car a name, you know, and they'll talk about their car, and they'll talk about the personality of their computer, you know, and how it's cooperating or not cooperating. We certainly anthropomorphize the pets that we have, you know, and I mean, and pets have a lot of real, like very much real personality, you know, because pets obviously really are alive and really are much more intelligent generally than we give them credit for. All animals are, I think. I mean, that's a key point there. I mean, the biological sciences don't attribute a lot of intelligence to other creatures, and I think that's a big misnomer. We're really discovering that other animal life is much more intelligent than we gave it credit for, and certainly much more sentient. You know, like sentience is the ability not to think but to feel. Sapience is thinking. Sentience is feeling, is emotion, is the ability to interact with the world and not to want to suffer, right? And pretty much every animal, every living organism has that, you know. And they have this developed intelligence not to, you know, to try to maximize their well-being and to minimize their suffering, you know. And that's, so all beings are like that. Then Buddhists talk about that, all the great spiritual traditions talk about that we're all akin to everything around us. And so it doesn't seem that far-fetched that machinery, that social machinery that we have to interact with each other, gets extended to animals. And in certain states of consciousness or developmental stages, there's these times when you're going to attribute more or less intentionality, as it's called, you know, intentionality or personality to things in your environment, you know. And that makes a good way to interact with them. I'll talk about that more in the Metapunk stuff. I don't want to get too far off topic, but the walls were talking to me, and a lot of the objects in my apartment were talking to me. A lot of my own body, different parts of my own body were sort of speaking to me in their own language. You know, there was a lot of communication from everywhere, which makes sense after a period of long isolation. I woke up one night and the devil was talking to me. And I found that really interesting because I'm not Christian. I haven't been Christian for a long time, like since I was a teenager. I was raised in a sort of loosely progressive Christian sort of milieu, like I had gone to church a few times. I had my grandparents had been regular attendees of church, and I'd gone to that church a little bit, and I had one parent who was a lot more religious than the other, and had taught me, just the basics of Christian metaphysics. Who is God? What's God all about? Created the universe and all that sort of stuff, and originator of all things in the world, and and that kind of stuff. God the Father. But I had gone through some difficulty when I was a teenager, and I'd really gone through a lot of nihilism. I had endured a lot of abuse, and I was depressed, and I wasn't really seeing a lot of hope in school or where I was at the time, and so I became an atheist. And then I went through another journey. I went off to university later on. I discovered Buddhism and really started to understand Christianity better through a Christian, from a Buddhist perspective. Something that Joseph Campbell always said was, if you really want to understand your own religion, then look at it through the eyes of somebody else's. Try to understand somebody else's religion. And I consider myself now to be something of a perennialist, an animistic perennialist. The perennialists, which look up Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts and people like that. The perennialists believe that, also William James, I think, is a psychologist. I think he might have been a perennialist, but the perennialists believed that there was a perennial philosophy. Oh, the transcendentalists, the transcendentalist philosophers from the United States. A lot of them were perennialists, and the perennialists believed that there was one transcendent philosophy, that, like the perennial philosophy, that was at the root of all the major world religions. That all of them were basically trying to say the same thing from a different point of view, with different cultural trappings. And so, and I think that's largely true. Like if you look at Christian symbolism and you look at Buddhist doctrine, like there's actually a lot of overlap, in pretty interesting ways, and so talking about a Buddha is not much different than talking about Christ consciousness, the different words for the same thing, and that's kind of how I look at it, and how I've looked at it since then. But I didn't formally believe in the devil or in hell, because I really believe that hell mostly is, as is said in Herman Melville in Moby Dick. He says, hell is an idea first born on a half-digested apple dumpling. Hell is a bad dream, and I think that's largely true. Hell is a bad dream, and it's a story that particular religions have used. Not all religions have an idea of hell, but particular religions use ideas of hell to control people. At least that's how it's been in the West. I mean, what better way to get people to attend church and to be afraid of your authority than to tell them that if they don't, they will burn forever in a dark, terrible place. They will be tormented. So I didn't believe in it, not consciously, but I felt like I'd been in another world. And so now the devil was showing up and telling me that I was in hell, and tormenting me and telling me I'd sold my life very cheaply, that I'd given away everything that really mattered to me, and that I was basically that I'd traded my life for a $5 footlong. That's literally what Satan in my experience said to me, and I didn't know what it was. And at the time, I had just gone through all these security screenings. I thought I was the victim of some kind of basically conspiracy theory, military security, police state, military industrial complex conspiracy theory, because I thought somebody was projecting this voice into my mind to torture me, and to try to upset me and unbalance me. But whatever it was, whether the devil was this metaphysical, whether or not the devil is a metaphysical thing, like some sort of a thought form or spirit of all of people's fears, coalesced into something that can actually bother people, again, I didn't believe in that at the time, but I don't know what to make of it. I don't know what the devil was in my experience. Some part of my own shadow, my own unconscious speaking to me, I don't know. It's very confusing, and I still don't know what it was. I was really frustrated with my life. Nothing was working. I stopped sleeping. I got very angry. I started working a dead-end job that wasn't leading anywhere. I quit that job because I couldn't sleep and because I was starting to hallucinate. At least that would be the official narrative. And so I started, walking to the hospital, trying to figure out what I should do. Initially, I went because I wasn't sleeping, but I was afraid to tell the doctors what was really going on, and I certainly didn't want to tell them that I was hearing things because I knew that they would discount that. So the medical system is the reason that I did not seek more medical help. Just so everybody is aware of that, I can't emphasize that point enough. It's so harmful that it doesn't encourage people to go seeking it out. But I was pretty desperate, and I was alone, and so I quit that job and I went into the hospital. And what they do in a hospital is they lock you up, they sign away your rights, they sign something which, at least in Canada, is called a section. The mental health, a particular section of the Mental Health Act entitles a doctor to declare that you're medically unfit to be on your own, that you're a danger to yourself and or others, and that they can medically, legally hold you in a secure facility, So, you get arrested for being in an altered state of consciousness. And if that doesn't, obviously ring alarm bells to people, then there's something really wrong with this culture. And it doesn't, that this is normal procedure for dealing with somebody who's in a mental health crisis, like a psychosis, is to lock them up and to have them deal with impersonal doctors, to take away their clothes and all their sense of identity. You don't even get to keep your ID. You don't get to you might get to hang on to your phone, which is how it works in this day and age. You might get your phone back, but they might even keep your phone from you. They take away anything that that they think that you might harm yourself with. They take away your boots or your shoes, because your shoelaces can be used as an implement. They take away. Then they don't take away bed sheets or pillowcases. They don't take away your hospital gown, but they take away your street clothes, and they take all these things away. So they basically sign away all your rights and they lock you up, and then you're dealing with impersonal doctors who are forcing you to take medication. And we wonder why people don't get much better in a psych ward. I don't know. I wonder why, but cage people and treat them like animals. But that was my experience, and so I had just gone through this whole thing where I was told by a disembodied voice that I was in hell and that I deserved to be tormented, and that I was, which makes sense if you have a guilty conscience. And I had a lot of guilt. That doesn't mean that I'd done anything particularly wrong to warrant being sent to hell, which again was confusing because it was a place that I didn't even believe in, and yet it was hard not to hard to convince me that I wasn't there because of everything that I was going through. The hospital was a whole other layer of this, because a hospital is a medical place. It's sterile. It's you are locked up. There's all these other things going on in the environment, and you're in a hospital bed and you're being monitored, and people come into your room at night and they have to make sure that you're still breathing, and various other things. There's all these things that go on in a hospital which feel very alien and very impersonal. And so I was in hell, and I didn't know what to do about it, because I didn't know how I got there. I didn't know how to get out. I didn't know what I'd done wrong. Eventually I figured out that I hadn't done anything. I've made mistakes in life. I'm not a saint, but I finally figured out that it wasn't because I'd done anything wrong that I was there. It was just because these tormentors could get away with tormenting me, because they just like torturing people. And that's how it felt. It just, so my suffering was meaningless, which makes sense given everything that I'd gone through in my life before that, with all the frustration and nothing working out. So all of this was kind of going on, and I was hospitalized for a while, but they did give me medication. The medication did suppress the symptoms, which is not to say that it helped me at all, or it helped me a little bit. I guess it made me a little more functional It didn't address the underlying trauma. It didn't deal with any of the problems that had actually created the psychosis in the first place. It just suppressed the symptoms. And this is, again, another reason why the medical system doesn't really help people when it comes to psychosis. You know, not the mainstream one, not the main biomedical model. This is not a way to get better. This is a way to get functional, so you can go back to work in the cubicle farm. You know, that's kind of how I see it. And so anyway, they did that. They gave me the medication, and yeah, I was a little more functional, and I did feel a little bit better, but I still knew that there was something seriously wrong with my life. I still had to get my life back on track, and I still had this underlying trauma. So I'm starting to work on myself. I started taking yoga and doing some things to try to heal. Yoga is actually helpful, so I was doing that, and it was helpful. But I noticed that every time I took the medication, it felt more like that police state security, you know, coming down on me, right? It literally felt like a clamp on my head, like I was being jailed every time I took the medication. And that's literally what it does. You know, doctors don't take the medication that they prescribe, you know, like not psych meds anyway. And, well, they take some of them, actually. That's a whole other conversation. They don't understand that when you take these things, one of the crucial side effects is that they really suppress your entire dopamine system. And so your feelings of motivation, your feelings of satisfaction for doing anything, your feelings around doing things, the meanings that you ascribe to particular things in your life, all of these things get disrupted, and they get confined and locked down, you know. And so it very much feels like you're in a kind of mental prison. Somebody who's close to me had a friend who calls psych meds, you know, antipsychotics, calls them chemical straitjackets, and that's literally what they are. You know, thankfully they don't use real straitjackets anymore, but at least not anywhere I've been. But how horrifying is that? You know, you've got somebody who's in extreme emotional distress, and you lock them in a ward, and then you lock their mind in place so that they can't even think straight. And these things also have an effect on your body. Your body gets muscularly affected. Dopamine it helps regulate your muscle system, you know, like the way your muscles fire. That's why Parkinson's disease is largely a dopamine deficiency, you know, or at least that's a factor in Parkinson's. And so your muscles feel tighter, your body gets all tense. You know, all these things happen. You gain weight, you know, like you really are confined when you take psych meds. And so I felt this way, and I stopped taking them. And I was really angry, and I still had this sense that I was not in my right world, you know. And of course I stopped taking them, and the symptoms came back, and I started hearing things a lot more often again, and started getting some weird ideas. And I just wanted to get out of my life. I really wanted to kind of escape my situation. I wanted to bust out of hell. And I'd lived a really hellish life for quite some time, and I really hadn't had much of a break. And so that's why I went into the psychosis in the first place. And so anyway, so I started walking around without any ID, and I started just trying to reorient myself. And the long and the short of it is that led to me being hospitalized a second time. And again, they lock you in a ward. You're just pacing up and down the hallways. I felt like a caged animal. I was in much better shape at that point. So my body I was much more physical. And so I would just pace constantly because there was nothing else to do, you know, except pace or to sit. And when you're sitting, everything that's happening in your head, you know, like all these voices and all this interference that's going on in you mentally, it just eats at you, you know, like, and that's literally like, they think this is a healthy thing to do to somebody who's in psychosis, you know, lock them in a hospital ward and have them either sit around and think all day, or have them pace because they can't do anything else to get physical exercise, you know, and that's somehow supposed to, with the combination of medicine, that's somehow supposed to make people better. It doesn't. Anyway, I was in the hospital a second time. I family did visit during the first and second hospital stays, and so they did try to do their best, but they still very much believed in the medical system, and they also had limited means. We have a whole culture that makes it very difficult for family to even show up for each other. We don't have a strong sense of community, and people have to work, and people live far away from each other, and so they don't necessarily have the ability to actually be there with their family on a sort of continual basis, which is what somebody in psychosis needs. They need love, and they need acceptance, and they just need an environment where there's loving people around, people to interact with, and people to sort of moderate what they're going through, because that's what our social connections do. They moderate us. They keep us on track, They keep us on an even keel, and they sort of call us on our garbage, so that we don't get too carried away with our crazy ideas, That's why isolation can be so damaging to anybody. Whether or not they have a history of psychosis, they can develop psychosis because they're not grounded in anything else that's kind of real. And so we need those social connections. And you don't get those in a hospital environment. It's not a healing environment. So and our economic system pulls people away from each other, and so it also is very bad for people. And that's why there's a mental health epidemic right now. But part of it anyway. So I was hospitalized the second time. I got out of the hospital. I moved home, and again, I had family for those acute periods of time. I had family help me out getting to and from the hospital, family and friends, and I had a good friend drove me home. And but I again was living on my own after that, and spiraled again into another episode of psychosis, And I never really did come out of it. I really struggled to take the meds because they really did feel like they were making it worse, And the voices have a field day with that stuff, The medications also make you feel like you're being robbed. It felt like very much like my energy was being taken. There was all these metaphysical components to that. There's a lot of that floating around in the culture these days. There's even old esoteric ideas about spiritual warfare and that kind of thing, and just being aware of that stuff can be damaging, because it inclines you to thinking this way, and even if you're not, already frightened enough by these experiences, tales of hell or tales of spiritual warfare are going to do damage. That's why it's such a bad idea. That's why I didn't believe in hell in the first place. But still ended up finding myself there. So, yeah, there was a real sense of disharmony with everything. Everything was discordant. I would walk down the street, even though I was in psychosis. I would still walk up and down the street. When I was out of the hospitals, and I would hear the music playing in people's cars. All the cars got really loud. Everybody was really aggressive. I got really afraid of people outside because people were like kind of monstrous to me, and they all felt like they were watching me, and they were part of this drama. And yeah, really very much in a hell kind of environment, surrounded by monsters. Really afraid that I was going to be eaten. And after dark, I felt like the monsters would come out, and I could literally see things shambling up the street, like monstrous forms that were coming to get me and coming to get other people. I saw people running up the street. The weird part about that is I couldn't have hallucinated all of it. I might have hallucinated some of it. Some of it literally might have been a visual illusion, but a lot of it I didn't. People had reactions that I didn't make up, So just to be aware, whenever anybody is having a reaction, like when you see somebody in psychosis, they aren't imagining that they're in hell or imagining that they're in some other world. They are in that other world. As far as they are concerned, their whole experience is the reality of that place, And that's something we really need to recognize, because people, by and large, in the Western world really suck at taking other people's perspectives. We are really empathetically challenged in our culture, right? We really don't have a lot of compassion or understanding for other people. And that's where a lot of the abuse comes from, and that's what perpetuates it. And so in order to foster that, let me tell you that everybody is living in their own world. right? It's just that most people, most of the time when they're functional, their worlds overlap sufficiently that they can get along with and understand each other, right? But take somebody in psychosis and they're off the map. They're in their own world. They're not overlapping, their reality with anybody else's very much. And so they are literally in that other kind of space. And if they're going through a heavenly experience, they could be euphoric and they could be really feeling really good and talking about all these wonderful things. But if they're having a really dark experience, if they're feeling like they're in hell, then they are in hell. They are really there. What was really interesting for me was that after I went through the initial hell experience, at one point I felt like I was in an alien world. Another point I felt like I was in the classical underworld, which was really confusing. Because if I didn't believe in hell, I mean, I was raised loosely Christian, and certainly there's enough floating around in North American culture about hell and the devil and hell narratives and all that sort of stuff. But what there isn't a lot of is classical underworld mythology, and I know a little bit about the classical underworld, but I don't know a lot about it. I was literally in the classical, like the Greek underworld, which is very, very weird to me. I was in a completely different otherworld, or a really different underworld than hell. And so I was in multiple versions of afterlife torment, and that had its own kinds of torture that were different than the Christian ones. And what more do I say about that? It was really bizarre. And I felt like people were monsters and everything was disharmonious. I started to say that earlier. I would hear cars go by and the songs in their stereos were all terrible. Like the music in hell is awful because everything is disharmonious, everything is discordant, everything's out of tune, They say the devil's got all the best tunes. I completely disagree, The devil does not like good music. The devil likes ugliness and everything has to be gaudy and cheap, The devil thrives on just garishness, and so that's what everything was to me, and so that's where I was. I've talked for a full hour now about this. What more do I say? I at one point was hospitalized a third time. I went through some difficult experiences there. I had a doctor offer me electroconvulsive therapy because I wasn't speaking when I went into the hospital. They looked at me and they thought I was catatonic. Now, I don't know exactly what catatonia is all about. I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I wasn't talking to the doctors because I was afraid of what I might say. I didn't know if it was okay for me to say anything. I was reading meaning into every little event that went on in my life and in my environment, and so I was afraid that by speaking, I might do more damage to my world, so I was afraid to speak. That's something that has happened in both my psychosis experiences, both of like my long-term episodes or series of psychosis experiences. I really got afraid to talk because I didn't want to say the wrong thing. And I also didn't know how to interpret what people were saying to me. I was reading all this extra meaning into what they were saying. So I really couldn't interact very well with people. And when the doctors wanted to interview me, the third time I was hospitalized, they locked me in a room that looked like they might lock a superhero in or a supervillain, because it was literally, it had a big steel door, it was wide open. It also looked like something out of Guantanamo Bay, a big camera blister in the corner, looking down, big windows on the, like a total panopticon scenario, and a bed in the middle, and a chair that was way too heavy to pick up because they didn't want it used as a weapon, I guess, and big steel door though. It was like I could have been Magneto and I wouldn't have been able to throw this thing off its hinges, because that's how much they're afraid of people in psychosis. And what does that tell you? Very much I was under arrest in this environment, but I had these doctors come in and start asking me questions about what was going on. I also hadn't eaten. I was afraid to eat because I was afraid that if I ate, I would have to stay in this other world, That wasn't my own. And so, which is actually not that far-fetched a belief, you can see how a mind, when it's in a very childlike mode or an altered state of consciousness, could easily believe that. And that's a feature of many fairy tales, that it's a feature of the Greek underworld, for example, like when Persephone eats half of a pomegranate, she has to live half of her year in the underworld with Hades. And there's many different stories about that, but it has to do with her eating the food of the underworld. There's fairy tales about eating food from the fairy world, that you'll have to stay there. It's in, I think if you watch the movie Pan's Labyrinth, there's a little girl in that movie that gets transported. At one point she kind of goes into this underworld, and it is very dark and very kind of hellish and underworldish. And she's told, don't eat any of the food, because if you eat any of the food, you'll be trapped there. You'll be forced to stay, and enjoy the hospitality of these dark beings that don't at all care about you, not in a good way. And so I very much had all of this kind of going through my head. I very much felt like I would have to stay there, and I felt like I was enduring the hospitality of these monsters that didn't have any good ideas for me. And so I hadn't eaten for a while. I was starving. The doctors were interviewing me, and they were asking me questions, and I wasn't answering them. They thought I was catatonic, and because they thought I was catatonic, they thought I would be a good candidate for ECT. Never mind that doctors get paid $2,000 a pop for every time they do ECT on somebody. Even in Canada, where that will be paid for by the government, but the doctor would still get paid, and so there's an incentive to give as much ECT to people as they possibly can because they get paid to do it, and that's not okay, because they wanted to give ECT to somebody that didn't have catatonia, that didn't have another underlying condition, that literally was just in psychosis and wasn't unable to talk, was simply afraid to talk, So they misdiagnosed me. Thankfully, I had enough presence of mind to say no, but my God, the kinds of things that they do to people. ECT is torture, and a lot of what the medical system does is torture. What they do to people in psychosis is incarcerate them, and it is incarceration. They do not heal these people, They didn't heal me. They did offer me medication, and I finally took it because I didn't want to have to deal with all the voices all the time again. I didn't want to have to go through the hell that I was going through. But I still don't know what world I'm living in. And having to rebuild my life after all of that, I don't know. I wasn't in a good place in my life before. My health has really deteriorated because I did starve myself. I kind of, what's the word, zigzagged or whatever, and now I've gained a lot of weight. Partly that's the medication. I'm really out of shape now, and I still don't have a job, and I don't even know if my reality is my own, and I can look around, and in my head I can say, well, it looks like the same reality. You're still dealing with most of the same people, for all intents and purposes, you're in the same world that you were in before the psychosis, but there's a part of me that in my core does not believe that, and I don't know what to do with that, because it's a very uncomfortable feeling. It makes you feel very unsafe when you walk around. Just to go outside is very difficult, and I don't know. I think the only thing that's really going to help me get through that is time and faith. I think I just have to make the assumption, because this is the thing about metaphysics, is that you really can't prove anything about the world, which is why science is so interesting, because science really does acknowledge that you can't prove anything for sure about the world, but it does then pretend that you can, and that there are facts, and there are facts, there are certain things that we can rely on as facts, but I'm going to talk a lot about that on this channel in the Metapunk videos, because that all warrants saying. I just didn't know that I was going to have a psychosis before I started talking about it, so I'm sharing that with you, because this is mainly going forward on this channel. You're going to watch me rebuild my belief structure, and hopefully that will be educational for people watching. Hopefully that will be of some use to somebody else. I hope so. I hope it makes somebody's lives better. Like, I hate the thought that I went through all of this for nothing, and so I'm going to use that to give myself some meaning through this experience, but it was like the entire hell experience was my entire structure, my entire set of beliefs, everything I took for granted about my world and about my life, you know, collapsed and fell apart, and everything was up for grabs. Trying to reestablish a meaning of everything, and my psyche having to reorient itself and realize what's actually true about my world, because whatever I believed was true before wasn't working, you know, and so I have to rebuild that. And so you get a front row seat. And with that said, I think I've rambled enough about this. I've talked for over an hour about my psychosis. I'll just say that's that, you know. I hope this has shed some light on the whole thing. Okay, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. I will start getting more into Metapunk videos. I will be doing less and less of the Psychosis Diaries stuff, so just stay tuned for that. Thank you.